My name is Jason Ashworth. I'm the Certification Manager for Aircraft and Products at the CAA. Most of the DDHs and 146s and 148s would have met me previously as the team leader for product certification. We are running this as a bit of a stopgap. This is quite a bit of a shorter version of the seminar that we would normally hold. The last one we held was at the end of October last year, in person in Wellington. Our plan is at least to use this as a very quick summary and sort of catch up on what has been going on since then. And we tentatively are looking for another get together, possibly in person, face to face, either early or mid next year sometime. A lot has happened since that last seminar. The CAA has gone through the restructure and come out on the other end. I will give a very quick introduction to some of the key staff that the 146, 148 and DDHs will be liaising with. Some of those staff are familiar and some are new. We've obviously had this whole COVID-19 thing happen, and we'll talk briefly about at least what the CA has done and what we are seeing. Just last night, the 737 MAX was ungrounded, and earlier this week we also received news that we have a new director for civil aviation. So certainly there is a lot of things going on at the moment. So quickly moving to my slides, what I will do is just have a quick talk about the restructure and what it means for both us and for industry. So this is still current. As of today, Shelley Turner is still the acting CEO and Director of Civil Aviation until February next year. Below that you have in purple the ALT team, which is the Deputy Chief Executives. The acting Deputy Chief Executive for Aviation Safety is Dean Winter. John Kay, who some of you may know, is the DCE for System and Practice Design within the CAA, and he is also currently acting in the Organizational Development and Support role, which is Shelley's substantive role. Chris Ford is the DCE Aviation Safety, Aviation Security and Infrastructure, and he is currently on secondment. But that is his substantive role. And Kathy Robertson, we have, who is in the CAA on a secondment arrangement as the acting DCE Performance Monitoring Insurance, who is essentially covering for Dean Winter, as that is his substantive role. So the group that no doubt most of us here would be interested in is the Aviation Safety Group. That is split out into four fundamental functional activities. We have the investigation and response with Kuz as the manager. We have David Harrison, who is currently the acting manager certification. And under that overarching certification function, we have a very large team, and that is why it is split into two other units, which is myself managing the certification of aircraft and products. And that consists of, I'll get to that slide in a second, but effectively the aircraft inspection registration teams and the certifications. Adrian Duncan heads up the other unit, which is the certification of the organizations. And so that will deal with the Part 146 and Part 148 certificates in this context. Dave Harrison's substantive role is the manager of licensing and standards. and Steve Kern, who you'll meet later, who's in the room, is the manager for monitoring and inspection. It is just a short introduction. Those key players, some of those key players will give that you will interact with, are giving presentations later on their units and their roles. If we look at the my unit for a second, as I said, we are split into the aircraft inspection and registration teams and the product certification teams. Greg Bourne, who most likely most of you will know, has been made the permanent team leader for product certification. David Gill is still the team leader for aircraft inspection and registration. That team is to a large extent unchanged in terms of roles and responsibilities. Gary Leach, Owen Oles, and Judy as the aircraft registrar are all still there. We do have John Marshall, who came across from the Part 145 team as an extra airworthiness inspector, and we are currently recruiting another airworthiness inspector. And we have a new aircraft registrar, Robin Evans. For Greg's team, fundamentally unchanged, although we do have one new certification engineer, Glenn Somerville, who used to be on the NZDF side. He joined CAA prior to the restructure as a helicopter airworthiness inspector, and has now moved into the product cert team under Greg. Another team that is on there, which is being stood up and in the process of being stood up, should I say, is the emerging technology team. Now, this team is probably quite new for most. They are externally funded. They are funded through a model with MB around all things UAS and emerging/disruptive technology and the certification thereof. We're very lucky to have Rebecca Langton as the new emerging technology program manager, who managed to come out from the UK during this whole COVID debacle, and we are currently recruiting a certification engineer to support that team. I won't go through all the names on this, but this gives an indication of the size of the team under Adrian Duncan for the certification of organizations. It's probably quite small to read, but going from left to right, the way these teams are structured is a little bit of a break away from the rule-facing structures. We still have the rules there referenced for those who are seeking a bit of clarity on that, but they are really sector-focused. So from the left, we have Rod, who's the team leader for airlines and foreign operators. We have Chris Nichols, who's the team leader for air transport and flight training. So that's more the 125, 135 operators. We have Corey Price, who's the team leader for unmanned aircraft. So that's 101, 102. Paula Moore, who is the team leader adventure and recreation. So 115, 149. Vicky Coates, who is the team leader for ag and helicopters. Jonathan Mayne, who you'll meet later, as the team leader for certification in airworthiness certificates. So what that means effectively is Part 145, Part 146, Part 147, Part 148, and 90F. The red box on the right, there is no team lead there, but effectively that is the team of SMS specialists that are cross-cutting across all of those teams. So how does this new structure affect you as a DDH or a Part 146 or Part 148 holder? In simple terms, you will have some new faces and you will have some familiar faces interacting with you. One of the fundamental changes we have made is there is now one email address for all application certification. So whether that is aircraft facing, you're applying for an STC, you're applying for a mod authorization or an amendment to your organization, that is the email address for submitting applications. You may see some new names, especially around the team leader and management level, but you will likely interact with some familiar people. As an example, Steve Kern runs the monitoring inspection unit. So for an audit, it may be that you are liaising with him or one of his team leaders who will be new to you. And at an audit, you may have some new faces coordinating the audit and pitching up at the audit, but you are likely to see some of the same people at the audit as SMEs, subject matter experts, that you have dealt with in the past. Broadly speaking, the restructure for you can be broken down in terms of the certification function is effectively grouped into the following. Aircraft facing, so whether that is type certificates, STCs, mods, CFAs, or certificates of registration, you will be looking at the certification units, aircraft and products, which will be myself, David, Greg, and our team members. Organization facing, you are looking at the certification unit organizations, which is managed by Adrian Duncan, and they will manage 148, 146 certification and amendments. And there is people facing, which is licensing and standards, and some of the changes that you will see there are, for example, test pilot approvals are coordinated through licensing and standards, but do require support from our teams. The one exception to this, and is an important exception, is design delegation holders. The product certification team, since they deal directly with modification authorizations, STCs, any associated design changes, the product certification team retains the overall responsibility for oversight and certification of design delegation holders. So the first point of contact there is either myself or Greg Bourne. COVID-19 and the impact on us, and I mean us as in the CA and what we're seeing in industry. This is just an example of the work requests that were raised per month. So these are applications coming in just to my units. So anything aircraft and product related, aircraft or product related. The blue chart there is 2019. You will notice it's fairly consistent, except for when we get around Christmas time, when all of a sudden people want to start flying and change position of aircraft. A lot happens in those last few months. And the red one is 2020. And as you can see, something happened around, I should explain, the horizontal axis is months. So something strange happened around April, clearly, and something strange happened around August again. No prizes for what that might be. What is interesting is the rate of recovery. This is a chart that was published by EASA on what they saw the European air passenger traffic forecast and what the recovery would look like potentially. That green part of the curve is something that is coming up everywhere around what COVID and the effect there is from it. It's effectively looks like an L shape, and depending on different recovery scenarios, you either get a best case, middle case, or low case. Just going back to that curve of what we're seeing, certainly we are seeing those L's appearing certainly around every lockdown period. What is promising, however, is our rate of recovery is certainly a lot quicker domestically than some other countries. It does beg the question, however, and I'll just leave this as an open question for us to think about, is what are the risks to aviation now that we are going through this pandemic, and certainly what will they be during the recovery process? We are very conscious of the fact that although we are trying to be as reactive as possible in this current phase of the pandemic. What happens when the ramp up occurs, and can we do it safely? And so with that, I'd like to introduce Jonathan Mayne, who's the team leader for 145, 146, 147, 148, and 19F. And he will give a brief introduction on his unit. Thank you.
Hi, my name's John Mayne. I'm the team leader, as Jason just said, for the 146, 147, 148 and 19F team. There's a new team stood up as part of the organisational development review. Currently, as you can see on the structure on there, there's 6 inspectors. Unfortunately, 2 of them are still in the training. One actually hasn't started until December, so I've just put his name on there to fill the box. But in that team, most of our work is focused around the 145s and the support of the 119 activities. And from there, you can see the number of certificates we look after. And the 146 and 148 are only a minor part of the workload we've got. And as you can appreciate, we're extremely busy with all the other work. So if you're going to do any amendments or any changes to your certificate, I appreciate as much notice as possible so we can schedule it in. I haven't got much more to add than that. So moving on to Steve Kern.
Morning everyone. This is Jonathan said, my name's Steve Kern, Manager of the Monitoring and Inspection Unit. We are one of the outputs, I guess, from the restructure that came into effect on 1 July. The authority recognised as part of that reorganisation that across the authority there hadn't been a large focus on monitoring and inspection for several years for various reasons. That's not to say that the aircraft and products team weren't doing quite a bit of monitoring of your sector, but generally across the CAA it had been dropping off quite significantly because of other demands. So we now have a team dedicated to that monitoring function. We have a team of 20, as you can see there in the org chart. We currently have several vacancies. A couple of the staff that I've got on there haven't actually started in the unit, but will be starting at the end of this month. And we have 1 staff member starting in mid-December as well. So we're still recruiting to fill positions. 14 inspectors, a couple of team leaders. Trevor, Jelly there in the middle near the top, is our senior technical specialist, mostly focusing on planning and programming. He would have been here this morning, but unfortunately he's sick at the moment, so wasn't able to be here. We also have a couple of administrative assistants there as well at the top. Wouldn't be a presentation to a bunch of engineers without a few numbers, so here's some for you. 14 inspectors in our unit. As part of the reorg, the Aviation Safety Group was given a huge sector to oversee. We have over 500 certificated organisations that we oversee as a group that hold over 700 certificates. And there are also over 5,400 aircraft in the system at the moment as well. So it's a big sector, and just a small team from our perspective monitoring that huge sector. But as Jason pointed out earlier on, the aircraft and products team still has specialists in the team that we'll be drawing on to assist with the the monitoring and inspection activities that we undertake. So you will still see familiar faces as we move ahead. We'll be needing to draw on their expertise and accompany us to audits. And that's not just in your area, 146 and 148, but across the board. Our team does have a number of safety management specialists that we've managed to bring on board. And that's certainly an area that we're going to be targeting as we get into this a bit more in future. Another thing I forgot to mention, down the bottom of the page there, you'll see an email address, monitoring at caa.govt.nz. That is our primary address for contacting us when you're dealing with findings, audit activities. That's where you'll get notifications from of upcoming audits, things like that. Our statement of intent, our current statement of intent, and it's not too different from previous years, has quite a focus on the authority being risk-based and intelligence-led. And the statement there I've got circled from the chairman just last year talks about the authority being risk-based and intelligence-led. It's very much a driver in what we're doing at the moment. As a team, we are questioning everything that's been done in the past. We're not taking it for granted. We're not just carrying on because it was done in the past across the board. So we're questioning all of that. But very much being risk-based intelligence-led is a key driver for us. The statement of intent, by the way, is also under review, given all the changes that we've been going through as an organisation, plus the industry itself. It's currently under review at CAA, and the aim is to get a new statement of intent out by the end of this financial year, so ready for the next financial year, come 1 July next year. Interestingly, even though we've got this focus on being risk-based and intelligence-led, you won't find a definition in the CAA, in any CAA material about this. So we've been thinking about that. It's been thought of for a new monitoring policy as well. But this was a diagram that I put together to try and represent what it means to us, and it's still evolving. So essentially what you have there in the light blue is all the data and information that we have in the circle there. Some of it is held internally at the CAA, some of it is out there being held by you and other participants out in the aviation industry. We apply some evaluation to all that information that we have, some analysis and interpretation, and at the end of that we come up with something we call intelligence. And from there we also have a limited resource that we have to use to do our monitoring function. So we have to apply some prioritisation there based on risk to think about what we're going to do, who we're going to visit, those sorts of things, the issues that we're going to focus on. So that might mean education and guidance. It might also mean monitoring and inspection. It also means all those other things, certification, engagement, surveys, investigations as well. And it's an iterative process that goes round in a circle and a loop. In terms of prioritisation, we've got a lot of feeds into that. At the top there you'll see 2020 strategic priorities. Those are priorities set for this current financial year by our board. So we have those to work with. We have a regulatory operating model which is currently under review, also aiming to get a new one out within the next 12 months or so there. Surveillance policy and procedures, they're being worked on too at the moment. We've got focus areas for the authority as well. There's thought been given to that, whether they're fit for purpose still, whether we need to have some different focus areas. We've got sector risk profiles. Nothing specific to the 146, 148 area, but certainly for the key commercial operational areas, there are sector risk profiles with risks identified in those by the participants themselves. We've got a thing we call Regulatory Safety Management Systems, RSMS. This is an initiative of the CAA to internally to look at risks out in the sector, particularly where they cross over across units in the CAA. To deal with those risks, we need different units to buy into that. In the past, there hasn't been a clear leader of that work stream, but as part of the reorganisation, we now have a small team of 3, I think it is, regulatory interventions team, headed up by Jack Stanton, and they've already put out one of their first products, I guess, if you like, an intervention, which is focused on the fixed wing flight training sector, and that has very much taken all the information that we have about issues in that sector, pulled it together into a package, an intelligence briefing package with tasks to do, with initiatives to do, and part of that's going to involve our team doing some monitoring and inspection. We also have international agreements and arrangements in place as well, and I see that there's a slide later on about that sort of thing as well. We've got a limited amount of time, so our thinking currently is we'll split it up something like this. The pie chart probably will move a little bit and we'll need to be flexible anyway. But the interventions that I just mentioned from Jack Stanton's team will take up a reasonable slice of our time. Another part there is high consequence. So by that we mean organisations that don't necessarily have a high likelihood, but they have a high consequence if something bad happens. Our national carrier, for example. We're also seeing major design organisations and manufacturing organisations like, for example, Pacific Aerospace being a high consequence type of organisation. So we're setting aside some time to focus on those high consequence sectors. We've got routine, which is certainly the majority of what we'll be doing will be more routine, but I'll talk a little bit more about what routine might look like in an upcoming slide. And then lastly, validation, and that's simply there are participants that won't come up on our radar because we don't see them as being necessarily high risk compared to others, but we're going to do some validation as well and just check our thinking there and go out and look at some of those as well. So we've got a toolbox that we can use to do monitoring and inspection. And these are some examples of that. Desktop review of documents. So an example of that is looking at post-certification, how things are going in an organisation. Sampling of returns from participants, and in this sector, an example of that is the Form 337s that we get sent and the data packages that come in for that. So sampling those from the desk, from the office, we see that as being part of our monitoring activity. It can include structured conversations, so phone calls. We're nearing completion of a COVID spot check program that we've been doing, looking at operators, and part of that involved some structured phone calls to talk through the risks as we were seeing them in the sector and to get feedback from the chief executives that we phoned around, and also that helped inform who we actually visited. It could also involve formal interviews, so as a dedicated monitoring activity, having a formal interview with a senior person in your organisation. It could be recorded, video conferenced, so we're also thinking about that. Surveys is something that's been done already, certainly in the operational sectors. it is something that could be done in the 146, 148, 145 sectors as well. As I mentioned before, or touched on anyway, certification, or certainly for renewals of certificates, at least in part, that is a monitoring activity. We won't get away from on-site visits as well in the form of spot checks and audits. But we'll also be looking not only at participants, we'll be looking at sector issues. So taking a slice across sectors and looking at particular issues there as well. And not quite so relevant for you, but operational checks, things like en route checks as well, are monitoring activities. And then we have four aviation safety advisors who are out there talking to you, getting around to participants in the field and feeding back information as well. That's all part of our monitoring. It's less formal and normally de-identified as well, but it still feeds back information back into the CA that we can help inform our intelligence picture. So that's me. Thanks very much.
Tēnā koutou katoa. Good morning all. My name is Greg Bourne. I'm team leader for product certification. Just before I kick into the slide material, I just want to note, I think there was about 50 participants online. I'm just looking to 60 now. And obviously there'll be more people who are sharing screens and things like that. So pretty good turnout. I'm pretty pleased with that. And it's one of the upsides is it's potentially more accessible to people with this kind of format. One of the downsides is you don't get to see the fact that I'm wearing shorts and jandals, so benefit for all there. Just a quick reminder, if anybody's got any questions, please feel free to fire them into the chat function of Skype. And hopefully Tim, who has been an absolute saint organising all this, will relay them to myself and the other team. After I've done this bit, we'll have a short break, and then it'll be just the design delegates coming back for a bit more of an interactive Q&A session. But certainly after this, I can answer questions, and Jason and Steve are around as well, so they'll also be able to answer questions. Another point to note as well is that we are recording this session, so if technology allows and it all works out, then we'll be able to put it on the website, and you'll be able to replay everything that I've said. Fun for all the family. So we'll kick into it. So Jason's already sort of given a bit of a brief overview, but there's some pictures of my team here. We're at full staff at the moment. As Jason mentioned, new faces since the last design delegation seminar is Glenn Somerville, who joins us from the Royal New Zealand Air Force. He was manager for the aircraft structural integrity unit, and also worked on the structural integrity program for the C-130. Also spent some time in the maintenance planning, and before his master's degree in engineering, he was on the tools, so actually comes with some practical experience as well, which is always good with a design engineer. Roughly split in the team, we are pretty much 50-50 avionics structures now, so a good blend of people, as well as Tim on the flight test side of things, so we feel like we've got a good breadth of experience. In terms of the things that we do, what we're responsible for, again, it's sort of been teased out a little bit, just for a bit more detail though. So we're directly responsible for the typical design approvals, so TCs, STCs, mods, TSOs, PMAs. We do all the validation of design approvals, so acceptance of type certificates from overseas, so type acceptance, acceptance of technical data and specifications. And as Jason mentioned as well, we're directly responsible for the design delegation holders' new renewal process, and to some extent the monitoring of those design delegation holders as well. And again, as Steve mentioned, we're giving support as SMEs to both the certification function and the monitoring and inspection functions for the 146s, and to a lesser degree the 148s, but to some extent John's team can sort of handle that more capably. Also, we're giving support to the certification team for Part 102 certificates, so that's unmanned aircraft operators. And the element of the Part 102 rule that we really come into play is with regards to initial airworthiness. I'll talk more about UAS. I've got some slides on that in the future. Also, PBN approvals, so we directly do the approvals for Part 91, but also giving SME input into the airworthiness aspects for Part 119 operators, PBN approvals. And then lastly, we continue to do the collaboration aspects in terms of working with our bilateral partners and also on various working groups regarding airworthiness, so ASTM, EuroK, SAE, Gamma and a whole bunch more. And Charlie Morris is really our focal point for those kind of working groups, but also a lot of the other team are getting involved in different aspects as well, so we've got some breadth through the team. Some stats, not many, so don't worry too much. So STCs this year, as Jason mentioned off, this year's been a bit of a funny one in terms of workload. 2019 was particularly notable in terms of new STCs. We had a very high number compared to previous years, not so many amendments, and that was largely due to some big projects around BK117 upgrades. This year is a very different story. Our STC numbers are quite down on what we've had in previous years in terms of applications. And obviously there's a month to go, 2 months to go, so there'll be a few more there, but otherwise pretty down. That's been made up for in terms of type certificate amendments, which we've had some fairly big projects for our key type certificate holder, Pscp Aerospace, which has kept us busy in that downturn on STCs. Just a reminder, I think Jason flashed this up at the last design delegation seminar, that STCs, whilst everyone thinks that it's a big amount of work and it goes to the CIA black hole and we spend hours and hours over it, well actually the vast majority, so over 110 of the STCs in the last 5 years were less than 10 hours in terms of CIA chargeable time. So not a huge cost to applicants in the vast majority of cases. Obviously there will be some more complex STCs that take longer. So, you know, there are some there in the 50 to 70 hours, but they are big STC projects, you know, re-engines, complete glass cockpit suites and that kind of thing. It's also worth noting that we're getting some success now. We've been using the finding of compliance system in terms of giving some responsibility back to the design delegation holders when it comes to STCs. So that system came out a while ago and been working really well in terms of STCs and lightening the load on CAA, but again, as I say, giving responsibility to those design delegates. In terms of international engagement, we have been doing some work in that space, both with the FAA and the ARSA. So on the FAA front, for those that are really into their bedtime reading, the implementation procedures for airworthiness, or the IPA, which sits under the bilateral agreement, is getting a little out of date now. Last update was back in 2015. We kicked off a process to do a few minor amendments in terms of some of the job functions and names under there, but also the key one was really the clauses around transfer of electronic documents. So we were finding there were still some cases where the FAA were expecting big boxes of paperwork, which in today's day and age is just a complete waste of trees. So this was prior to COVID. COVID's come along, the FAA have slightly changed their policy now, and they're much more looser in terms of allowing electronic data transfer. So we're looking to embed that into the IPA agreement. During those discussions, we talked to the FAA about the potential for moving towards a bigger amendment of the IPA, and it's really focuses around moving to a risk-based validation process. So for those that know the IPA at the moment, it's very much tightly defined scope in terms of the FAA accepting Part 23 STCs, Part 27 and 29 STCs of a very small sort of roll equipment kind of level, and Part 25 interiors. So again, a very tightly controlled box. And if we wanted to come along and have anything else validated by the FAA, then typically there's a whole process you have to go through to amend the IPA. It's a very lengthy process. The other thing that for those people that have worked with the validation process with the FAA is that we kind of give those STCs over for validation, and it's a bit of a how long's a piece of string in terms of how long the FAA take to do that assessment process and what their depth of review is. So by moving to a risk-based validation and a risk-based IPA model, we do away with that scope. It goes to a separate area that's more easily updatable. We have much more assurance about those things that are in scope in terms of timeframes. So the FAA have committed to saying that anything under this risk-based validation model that the FAA already have confidence in us. So those Part 23 STCs, those 27 STCs, it's basically an admin approval. So it goes to the FAA, they say it's a 10-day turnaround, and we get the FAA validated STC back. So real surety around for industry on what the expectations from the FAA are. It also gives us more flexibility in terms of getting new things in scope. So there's huge opportunities for increasing our scope very easily and very quickly. And it opens up the door for things like unmanned aircraft systems, which are currently just not covered by the IPA. Similarly, with so that won't be a quick process, unfortunately, in terms of the FAA update. They've indicated somewhere between a year and 18 months. And also we're juggling resources to be able to do that in our policy department here at CAA, but it's definitely on the horizon and something that our senior management is very keen on. Similarly with the ARSA, Jason's currently working on the working arrangement with the ARSA. Again, for those that know it, it's very tightly scoped towards our Pacific Aerospace and Alpha aircraft. We're looking to expand that to a greater design world, so they have more of a bilateral type agreement in terms of our design approvals. Again, not going to be a quick process, but it has started and the ARSA are assessing things at the moment. So just recently, hopefully everybody caught the letter memo that I sent out regarding Part 23, specifically the certification basis regarding the latest amendments of Part 23. So you've seen that the subheading there, it's essentially the FAA's 14 CFR 23 Amendment 64 and the EASA's CS 23 Amendment 5. Apologies for all those 148 people that are on the line, but this is a little bit more on the design side. So some key things out of that letter to note is that the FAA and the EASA both have means of compliance documents on their websites, and they're much more important now. These performance-based certification requirements have been released at those amendments. But the key thing to note is they are slightly different. So it's depending on which regulatory system you're using, and it's important to use the correct means of compliance and follow those documents. The other key thing is that you must use those means of compliance. It becomes absolutely more critical now to not just put the rule in terms of the 14 CFR 23 requirement rule. You also need to put what means of compliance you're using, and they need to match the FAA ones. And it's important they go on either the Pscp, your compliance matrix, and your technical assessment. So that way you've got traceability down to the actual prescriptive requirements, which are typically those in the ASTM F44 standards. The other expectation is that, look, all design organisations, there's no way that you can't be an ASTM member now, because you need access to those F44 standards. Membership is not expensive. It's $75 US for an individual. It's $400 for an organisation. So it really isn't a big expense. Unfortunately, we can't provide those standards because they are proprietary. Whilst the ASTM standards are typically the means of compliance, they're not the only acceptable means of compliance. We can accept others, and that's the great benefit of moving to these amendments. It opens up the scope for alternate means of compliance, perhaps when it comes to those novel designs, like electric aircraft and so on and so forth, where the standards are either in development or coming up to development. But again, it's really a CIA decision, and it would require an issue paper, so please apply to us early to get those alternate means of compliance. Some big differences that are now become apparent between Amendment 64 and Amendment 63, and that's largely due to those ASTM standards actually coming into force and changing and up issuing. And particularly those differences are quite large when it comes to low speed handling characteristics and icing. So some of my team are across those kind of differences, so feel free to give us a call and we can talk you through those. Last point I wanted to note is that for those that, again, this is the difference between a method of compliance, i.e. similarity, design, test, analysis versus the means of compliance. So if you are proposing a method of compliance of similarity and you're using the latest Amendment 64, but the thing that you're showing similarity to is an earlier amendment, then you really have to look into the difference between those amendments before you can claim similarity, because at the end of the day, you've got to claim certification compliance to the latest amendment. So it may not always hold true, particularly in those areas like the low speed handling, where the rules have significantly changed. Another area of change in terms of the design world, but also could affect maintenance and manufacturing. In fact, it definitely does affect maintenance. Is cybersecurity. So for those that are keeping abreast of recent developments, there are a number of policy statements coming out of the FAA and EASA. I won't go through all the details on this slide. It's a pretty heavily detailed slide, but really the slides will be available later and you can read through them in your own time. So there's a lot of information on there. The key thing to take away here is that it affects all aircraft, so from Part 23 through to 25, 27, 29. And the FAA and the EASA have taken slightly different approaches in terms of what cybersecurity requirements apply to. So the FAA have some failure criticality attached to it, and that it's only for those systems with major or hazardous or catastrophic failure conditions. Whereas the EASA have a much more blanket approach, and it also applies to things like engines and APUs and propellers. FAA have been applying special conditions to STCs that involve the kind of systems with those failure modes for cybersecurity. So for those that are interested, there are some good examples. The Garmin G5000 STC is a good one. And similarly, we're working internally to develop a template special condition for cybersecurity until such time as those rules come into force. In terms of how you actually comply with those cybersecurity requirements, then again, I've put down some of the typical means of compliance there, like the RTCA, DO documents, and also ASTM are working on their 44 draft standard for how to apply that for Part 23 world. So certainly worth for those in the avionics world getting familiar with those, because we will be levying those requirements, and they're also coming into the rules. It's a through life requirement as well, so it affects maintenance of the aircraft. So it's worth bearing in mind. So continued professional development has been pretty hard this year. If any of those design organisations are like the CAA, then our budgets have been slashed in terms of training. the flip side to that is that there's more training opportunities that are available free and online now because of the COVID situation. So we've actually, the team has been doing a lot of online sessions, both working groups and training sessions. They're actually a lot more cheaper than sending people overseas now. So we're getting a lot more value for money in terms of our training. The expectation for Part 146s and 148s is to keep your competency up, and certainly in the 146 and 148 rules, requirements to do that. So I've put some suggestions here of different opportunities for training. This is by no means an endorsement from the CIA that these are good training courses, but it's the kind of stuff that I'm looking at sending my staff on, so it might be useful to yourselves. So again, I won't go through all of them, but certainly Kansas University have been offering aerospace short courses for a long time now, and they have a lot more online courses, a whole gamut of technical disciplines. Flight safety, again, for both the 146s and 148s, run a good number of courses, and they're actually really low cost. Everything from human factors to a lot of Gen Fam type, or general familiarization type courses. RDCA is probably more on the technical side of things in terms of avionics requirements. And FAA, I've mentioned it before, but they do their DER training and a whole bunch of really good, really cheap courses. So I think it's $50 or in that region to join up as a pretend DER, and you get access to things like FEA courses, crashworthiness on seat courses, all sorts of stuff there. So definitely worth taking a look at in your spare time. And then obviously Tim has been doing a great job of running the Royal Aero Society CPD sessions. So seen some really good attendance from the 146s on those courses, on those sessions. So it's been good that people are grabbing a coffee and listening into those. Again, as well as the courses, there are a whole bunch of industry seminars, which are typically online and free. For those of you that are members of organisations like the AEA and ASTM, they're running a lot of committee meetings and plenaries, and they're all online and free. The working groups are free, and you can sort of dip in and choose which topics you like. JARIS is to do with unmanned systems, typically for authorities, but they're also involving industry now. So for those 146s that are starting to get involved in unmanned systems, well worth a look. And again, I'll talk more to JARIS's work and how that's applicable potentially in the future for 102 operators and drone airworthiness as well in some later slides. FAA Rotorcraft Safety Seminar, I don't know if anybody was able to join that, but that was just a month ago. But they're also running a bunch of seminars, as are EASA, so worth keeping an eye on the websites and the notifications for them. So again, these slides will be available, so feel free to dip into these at a later date. Looking forward to some of the work that's going on. There's a lot of advisory circular AC development that we're getting involved in at the moment. Again, I won't go through all of these, but some to note is that AC21 for flight test guidance, which is due an imminent release, I believe. Tim's been working on that for a while now. So that will be really useful for both applicants involved in flight tests, so on the 148 and 145 side, but also those conducting and writing test plans for flight tests, so the 146s. And it's really a best practice kind of guide. AC00-6 was released again about a month or two ago. Charlie did a huge amount of really good work on that. In terms of electronic signatures, electronic manuals, I know it's a question we've been having for a long time now, is what do we as 146s or 148s need to do in terms of our procedures to introduce an electronic signature system? Well, this AC really spells it all out for you, and it's the kind of thing that both John's and Steve's team will be looking at in terms of compliance. AC21, so some of the things that we're working on, the AC21-8 for supplemental type certificates. So the kind of things that we're looking to update there in terms of updating the Pscp template that's in it. We're trying to align it with the same one for type certificates. Again, so Tim's working on the AC21-7, which will be a new release for type certification. But really embedding in the finding compliance process, because we're finding that's been quite successful. The other aspect, so AC146-1 for essentially design organisations, there's a few things that's really overdue in terms of a refresh, and we've probably said before we were refreshing it, but actually we're getting a bit of time to work on it now. So Kavita's leading the charge on that one, and there's a number of things that we're looking to work on. So scope definition for both the 146 scope and design delegation scope. There really is a lack of consistency between design organisations, and there's also a desire to come more into line with the EASA and FAA, who have much more tightly defined scopes for 146s and design delegation holders. We recognise that New Zealand is a different environment, so we certainly don't want to copy what the EASA and FAA do. If anything, they have incredibly complicated long lists, and with the EASA it's spreadsheets full of the kind of tick box requirements that you need to say what your 146 scope is. We don't want to go to that length. We want something that's simple, functional, and makes sense from a 146 and DDH space. So again, Jason mentioned we're hoping to hold another session later on in the next year, but we might even do a separate session to discuss some of the ideas that we're having and make it a collaborative approach to developing that scope with 146s and design delegates. Also, something that and we get a number of questions on is the design renewal, delegation renewal process. So we're looking to clarify what that process is. Also clarifying guidance on standalone FMS approvals. So what I mean by that is where the design change is just a change to the flight manual supplement. We've had a number of questions of people asking whether or not that is a design change. Well, it clearly is, because you're changing technical data, so it's something you need to approve, but it doesn't necessarily need to be a physical change to the aircraft. Similarly, just removing the negligible weight and balance to align with some of the other ACs where we've taken that out. And that's, look, in today's day and age, every weight and balance could matter. So we're taking those definitions out, and the expectation is that weight and balance is included in all design changes now, because the cumulative effect of lots of small changes in weight and balance could add up. Just the last two there, so AC 4314, which is more for those installers of modifications, but worth noting for design organisations that these are the kind of things that we're thinking about in terms of simple mods that people can just get on and do without needing approvals for. So this will create acceptable technical data for things like LED light installations, angle of attack sensors, which obviously increase the level of safety, carbon monoxide sensors, real-time tracking systems like spider tracks, which are kind of bread and butter. And then NVIS has been something that, again, the current AC needs some clarification. It's a little bit muddled in terms of the operation on the airworthiness approvals. There's also some work going on in terms of rule requirements for personnel for NVIS, so we're trying to tie in with that and work on those policy changes. Good. So some hot topics, continuing airworthiness. Again, going back to some stats here. So I just did some quick looking on a database. There were over 1,100 defect occurrences that were reported to CAA over the last year. Of all those defect occurrences, those Part 12 reports, there were nil reported from 146s or 148. I find that slightly hard to believe. There were, however, 32 related to New Zealand type certificate holders, and they were typically raised by maintenance organisations or the 145 aspects of the TC holder themselves. There was also only one with a keyword STC in it, which was raised by a maintenance organisation, and we work through the issues with the design organisation involved. But the expectation is that even if the maintenance organisation or the operator raises a 005, then both the 146 and the 148, if they are involved, if their manufactured parts or their design are involved, then they need to raise a Part 12 005D as well. And the reason for that is that Part 12 requires you to. It includes those certificates, and it also triggers the reporting function in terms of reporting the results of the design or the manufacturing organisation's investigation into what happened. It might be that the design wasn't the problem, but we still need to see those report and that conclusion and that logic that there was an investigation that took place, because a design organisation would do a very different investigation from the operator or the maintenance organisation. I guess one good point is that there was only one with a keyword modification throughout those 1100 defects, so we're not getting a huge number of problems with the 146 or 148 modifications or manufactured items. But again, that was one where the DO should have raised a 005D as well. Quick mention on human factors in design. Clarity of, so this is really some things that we're seeing in terms of STCs and mods coming through to us, and also feedback from some of our maintenance personnel as well. The clarity of your maintenance instructions in your instructions for continuing airworthiness are really important. It's just not okay to put things like installation as a reverse of removal. Maybe that was acceptable 10, 15 years ago, but it just doesn't make sense when the maintenance engineer's got to go looking for, well, what torques do I need to use to install these bolts? Because when you write something like that, it's not obvious. Similarly, statements like making new XYZ in accordance with AC 4313-1B. Well, AC 4313-1B is not manufacturing instructions, and it doesn't tell you what material to make that item from. So again, statements like that, generic statements, are just not okay. You need to actually put the details into your instructions for continuing airworthiness or into your design data. Again, just a note there in terms of different instructions for similar items. So where an STC or a mod replaces a type design item with another item and they look broadly similar, then there may be cases where it's okay that the TC instructions for continuing airworthiness are perfectly valid on that new item, but you need to make that judgment call about whether new instructions are required, and if they are, it's got to be really clear in your instructions for continuing airworthiness, and ideally it's either an IPC or an AMM supplement to make it clear that the part has been changed to prevent any confusion and to make sure that those maintenance engineers know which instructions for continuing airworthiness to use for that particular part. Also, make sure you consider the effect on or need for the master minimum equipment list supplements or updates. Again, we're finding a couple of cases where that might have been forgot about, particularly with avionics equipment, and particularly in this day and age when PBN approvals are really critical, and the equipage requirements may heavily change in terms of the MMEL. There's a couple of links there, just in terms of other human factors presentation that happened in the past, but also the FAA provides some really good guidance on human factors to help designers. So please do download these presentations, go to those links and have a read. Last couple of slides. I just wanted to mention unmanned aircraft. So I'm aware of a few design organisations being approached by unmanned aircraft, either people who have designed unmanned aircraft, or people who are looking to design them, or people who are looking to operate them. So I wanted to put a slide up. It's a very information-rich slide, but if you follow the arrows, hopefully it'll make sense and I'll talk you through it. So this is really to help those design organisations to understand what the CIA's approach is in terms of airworthiness of unmanned aircraft. So Part 102 rule basically covers unmanned aircraft operator certification. it's a performance-based rule in that there's no prescriptive requirements to say, well, if you're operating this unmanned aircraft, then you need to have this airworthiness standard met. What it does say is that the operator needs to provide an exposition which outlines the initial airworthiness requirements for those unmanned aircraft. Obviously, there's a massive range of unmanned aircraft, from your small, your DJI Phantoms and Mavics, right up to, I'm sure most people are aware of the Zephyr Whisk operation down in Tekapo, which is, two-person, completely unmanned autonomous vehicle. So there's a huge range in terms of complexity. What we're hoping to introduce, or what Charlie's done some really good work on, is defining an initial step where we sort of weed out all those simple unmanned operations that we know how to deal with operationally through those mitigations, versus the complex ones which may or may not require some form of initial airworthiness standards or certification. So there's a checkbox requirement which will be rolled out to industry at some stage, and we'll essentially define that. And if you fall into that complex operation, then our expectation is that you'll provide a risk assessment, and one acceptable means of risk assessment methodology is the JARIS SORA. SORA stands for Specific Operations Risk Assessment, and it really is just that. It's a risk assessment to say, within that range of risk, where do you lie, and therefore what are your requirements from a low to medium to high risk in terms of initial airworthiness requirements, but also a lot of other operational requirements, so robustness of your C2 link and all that kind of stuff. And those outputs will really give two things. So in the middle of the slide there, when it comes to certification, it gives you the level of assurance, i.e. how much oversight you require, and that might be an independent third party, it might be nil, it might just be a declaration, or it might be the full certification process from somebody like the CAA. The second thing that it will hopefully spit out is the level of integrity, i.e. what standards does your aircraft need to meet. It might be nil, it might be declared to an ASTM standard, it might be going showed dependability and reliability testing or data, and it might be full type certification to TC standards like 14 CFR. The really key thing to note there is that there are still not certification standards for some of the things that people want to do. So fully integrated in Class G airspace, things like the detect and avoid, things like artificial intelligence systems, the standards are still being developed. So it may mean that we can't allow those operations until such time as those standards have been developed and we understand all the risks and the mitigations from an airworthiness point of view that need to be put in place. Bottom right there, that little table is just an idea of some of the applications that we've got in progress at the moment. So it's taking more and more time from product certification team, but also the whole of CIA. Jason mentioned that Rebecca and the MB emerging technology team are handling a lot of those complex operations, but we'll still be providing input from an airworthiness point of view. So there's a whole range of applicants from the small size, 0 to 25 kg, right up to things like manned conversions of manned aircraft. And I think everybody's aware of the Tekapo operation as well, being over 600 kgs. Also, MB are running an airspace integration trials. So that's involving certain key industry partners, unmanned aircraft operators, and also local stakeholders, and bringing together a whole bunch of government organisations to try and move things along in terms of that space. When it comes to design and manufacturing of unmanned aircraft, our approach really is to knock off the three big things: aviate, communicate, and navigate. They're all the functions that the pilot would normally perform. So they're all the functions that now we're relying on systems to perform primarily, or somebody on the end of a communications link to perform. What a lot of people tend to forget about is that, it's pretty easy to control, to have a drone fly from A to B. The software's there, and it's pretty reliable and robust. What it doesn't like is upsets along the way. So that's where a detect and avoid system, it's not just about detecting other aircraft in air, it's about all of those other things there: terrain, birds, people, structures, buildings, cranes, everything. Dealing with emergency procedures, dealing with communicating with ATC. It's all things that traditionally the pilot's got to manage and can come quite unexpectedly. So we're looking at a functional approach to certification for those, replacing those requirements. And as I said, some of them just haven't been done to the full extent yet in terms of those standards, but we're looking on leveraging stuff early to be able to take full advantage of allowing those things to happen. So we're going to see if there's any questions.
But one for Steve. So from Flight Structures, they asked, what defines a high consequence organisation?
Yeah, hi again. We don't have a definition of it, but if you think about the risk in general is likelihood and consequence. So something that has a high consequence, I illustrated in my presentation, as being something like our national carrier, for example, where they might not have a high likelihood of an incident, but if something happens, it's going to be a high consequence. So we're bucketing some of the certificate holders into that sort of high consequence bucket.
So we have got a question where it just come up. So about removing negligible wet balance changes, will there be some guidance available to provide around what is when we can use negligible, e.g. wind corrosion, bend and leaf?
So it will become more of a judgment call for those people doing the mods. There's obviously some things where, putting a piece of speed tape on an aircraft is clearly negligible. We're talking grams on something the size of a 747 or 777. But the expectation is that even a few grams on the tail can make quite a big difference to your balance. So, and as I said before, the cumulative effect of a number of smaller changes can add up. So, even if it's less than a kilo, then you still got to be putting it in the information in there so that people can accurately do the calculations for weight and balance. So, the guidance that we have in the AC at the moment gave some figures around sort of, I think it was 1% and so many kilos, but we're looking to just remove that because it's not applicable in this day and age.